All right, it looks like I'm seeing most people have connected to audio, so I'm going to jump right in and get this going. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our session on how to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. My name is Steve Chybowski. We'll do a little longer introductions in just a moment, but thank you for joining us. So for today in this session's presentation, we'll start with some introductions from me and my co-presenter, Hannah. We'll introduce the organization that supports our work and some introductory materials for you all. Then we'll spend a few minutes going over greenhouse gases and climate change generally, just to help us all be on the same page of what that science looks like very generally. I won't be spending too much time on that topic as we only have so much time in this presentation to cover all the materials that we have. Then we'll move into talking about greenhouse gas emissions inventories themselves and show some examples of this greenhouse gas emissions accounting from here in Indiana. We'll discuss who has the data you need and where you would go to find the information that you're looking for if you're looking to do an inventory yourself. And then I want to highlight some of the programs and resources that the Environmental Resilience Institute has to offer. If we have time, I'd like to give everybody a brief break there, 5 minutes or so to stretch, but then I want to pass it over to my co-presenter here to provide a case study of her work doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the city of Huntington. And then lastly, we will wrap up with Q&A. So first, let me just give a more thorough introduction here. My name is Steve Chybowski, and I am the Resilience Cohort Coordinator with Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. And I will let my co-presenter go ahead and introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I am Hannah Staley. I was the Indiana Climate Fellow for the City of Huntington over the summer, and I am currently a grad student at IU in the MPA and MSES dual degree program.
Thank you. We also want to give a shout out and thank the presenting sponsor, the Indianapolis Airport Authority. The Indianapolis Airport Authority is doing great work in the field of sustainability. We really appreciate what they're doing and staying on the cutting edge of what they're able to do as an airport. And we really want to thank them for supporting our conference here today and being a presenting sponsor. So thank you. Just a quick note for everybody participating in this session. We do ask that you all close other tabs that you may have open on your computer. That can really help reduce lagging and other kinds of issues with these virtual conferences. So I just want to make a note of that. If you have a question for Hannah or I about this presentation, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A box. And if you're having any technical difficulties or logistical questions, things of that nature, please go ahead and put those in the chat box and we will look to respond to those as soon as we can. So I also wanted to give you all a brief introduction of the Environmental Resilience Institute itself. And this is where I work for IU. So the Environmental Resilience Institute is a research institution based out of IU Bloomington. We have an office that you can see here in this picture on IU Bloomington's campus. So if you ever want to come see us in person, we can set up an appointment and make that happen. And ERI was established about 5 years ago. And the mission of ERI is to enhance the resilience to environmental change in Indiana and the Midwest by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. So let me break that down a little bit as to what it is we do at ERI in a little more detail. So at ERI, we do have researchers that help us develop accurate predictions of how climate change is going to impact Indiana's environment and the Midwest and help us plan for those changes. These researchers also help us develop feasible solutions to these environmental changes that we're expecting to see here in the state. So those feasible solutions, that's feasibility both of a technical and just physical sense, as well as what it could be economically and financially feasible for us here in Indiana. At ERI, we support effective communication and try to get that information into the hands of practitioners with local governments and other organizations, as well as doing what we can to serve as a resource for any reporters and getting the messaging of this work out there through our media channels. And then we also work directly with local governments and organizations on implementing some of these solutions. And that's where my work as a resilience cohort coordinator lives, where I work directly with local governments to help them measure, manage, and track their greenhouse gas emissions. So we also do that work on the ground and helping with communities looking to get involved in their environmental tracking. So that's just a brief overview and introduction of who we are and what we do. I next want to talk about greenhouse gases, climate change, and the impacts that climate change will have on Indiana. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this section of the presentation, but I just want to make sure we all have some of the same baseline information of what's going on here. If you have questions, want to learn more about this topic, please feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to follow up with additional resources. But for sake of time, we're going to move right along through this information. So what are greenhouse gases? Let's just start there. Greenhouse gases are the gases that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And greenhouse gases are not inherently a bad thing. In fact, we need greenhouse gases for there to be life on Earth. What's concerning, though, is that we're seeing an increased level of greenhouse gases, and this is causing the Earth to warm, almost as if more and more blankets keep getting thrown on top of our planet. And according to NASA here, this warming is occurring at a rate 10 times faster than our planet would ever be able to warm on its own. And that 10 times faster rate is being caused by our anthropogenic activities, or our human-caused activities. So to just kind of summarize what this means is that our greenhouse gases are the drivers of climate change. To help kind of visualize what this looks like, naturally with the greenhouse effect, the solar radiation would shine down on our planet, heat up the Earth, and reflect off, and a lot of that heat would escape back into space naturally. But because of our human activities, we're greatly increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So when that solar radiation comes down and shines on our planet, it's trapping in a lot more of that heat that would normally reflect back into space, and causing our whole planet to heat up much faster than it normally would. And so what are the impacts of this climate change? Well, we are seeing global temperatures increase. So that's causing us to have hotter summers and causing the planet to have more and lengthier droughts. That's happening here in Indiana and all across the world. We're seeing warmer oceans, which is leading to an increase in hurricane and storm conditions. We're seeing ice sheets melt and glaciers reduced. So that's causing our sea levels to rise, leading to coastal erosion and increased flooding in our communities. We're seeing decreased snow cover. That's happening in places where it snows seasonally, as well as on our mountains that normally have snow year round. And that's really contributing to wildfires out west and all kinds of challenges throughout the world, similar to that. We are experiencing more extreme weather events, and we're experiencing ocean acidification, which is causing our coral reefs to bleach and destroying aquatic ecosystems. So again, just a very brief overview of how climate change is working and some of the problems that it's causing for us here on Earth that we need to adapt to. And next, I want to cover what are the primary greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. So here we have the 6 primary greenhouse gases that we generally look at when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions accounting and inventories, and the common sources of where they come from. And we'll be revisiting this slide with a little more detail later on in the presentation. But just to give you some sense of what these gases are, we're looking at carbon dioxide, CO2, which primarily comes from our energy generation and transportation sectors. Methane, which is CH4, and that largely comes from natural gas use and livestock. Nitrous oxide, or N2O, that comes from agriculture and wastewater treatment generally. And these next 3 greenhouse gases actually don't occur naturally in our Earth's atmosphere. They are entirely man-made greenhouse gases. So hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, those come largely from our refrigerants and aerosols, and again, do not exist naturally in our planet's systems. Perfluorocarbons, or PFCs, these are generally produced from aluminum and semiconductor production. And sulfur hexafluoride, or SF6, and that's largely comes from circuit breakers, which are used to help us transmit our electricity throughout our country. So these are the 6 primary greenhouse gases that we look to measure and track and are concerned with. And what are the impacts of all of this on Indiana specifically, and what have the impacts been? Well, over the last century, we have seen the annual temperature of Indiana increase by 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, that's the average temperature over the full calendar year, and that's really a relatively dramatic increase over that length of time for our planet. As a result, we're seeing a longer frost-free season, and that could potentially mean that we could see longer growing seasons with less frost. But that also would mean that we're experiencing pests that are not going into their version of hibernation in these times without any frost on the ground. We're experiencing fewer cold days in Indiana. We're experiencing significantly warmer overnight temperatures, and that's very problematic, as a lot of heat-related health issues occur in the nighttime when people have already gone through an extremely warm day, and then they don't even get any relief from that heat at night. That's where a lot of various heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses can occur. So that's especially problematic. And here in Indiana, we're experiencing more heat waves that are longer and hotter. Covering what these impacts look like on Indiana a little bit more. So on the left here, we're seeing what temperatures are expected to be like in Indiana by the 2050s. So if we are able to curb our emissions and get them down to a moderate level, we're still expecting Indiana's temperature to increase and resemble something closer to that of Western Tennessee. Now, if we continue business as usual and we do not get our emissions in check at all, Indiana's temperatures by the 2050s are expected to look more like Texas, which is quite a dramatic change from where we're starting from in Indiana in the Midwest. Also want to mention here how much precipitation has changed in Indiana over about the past century. So we are seeing precipitation that's increased by about 5 to 8 inches, depending on where you are in the state, over the last 100 years. And that's a trend that's expected to continue. And what's interesting to note about that change in precipitation is that it's not happening at a comfortable and steadily spaced out pace throughout the year. What's happening is we are having longer and drier conditions for longer periods of time. And when we do have a rain event, those are being more extreme and causing more flooding happening all at once, rather than the rain events being a little more gentle and spaced out throughout the year. So that's kind of what that's looking like. As for how some of these changes are going to affect Indiana specifically, by about the 2050s, we're expecting corn yields to decline by about 16 to 20% by mid-century as a result of these climate changes. We're expecting Indiana to have reduced air quality, which will trigger more asthma and heart attacks and worsen respiratory illnesses in the state. As I said, we're expecting increased precipitation, which will increase flooding risks. And we're expecting the allergy season to lengthen by a month as well by mid-century. So these are all different issues that we're expecting to have happen here within the state of Indiana as a result of climate change. I want to point you all to a wonderful resource that really dives into how Indiana is going to be impacted by climate change, and that's the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. So this is a tool developed out of Purdue University and is available on their website. And they've put together 10 reports diving into each of these different topics that you can see on the screen here. So it's really detailed and is specific to what's going to happen here in Indiana. So it is a great resource to dive into for this work. So what do we do about all this, right? And that's a big part of this conference this week. And step one for us is to reduce the threat. Reducing the amount of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere will make these future impacts less severe for us and our children. The more we reduce these future emissions, the less suffering and disruption Hoosiers and the global population will experience down the road. In Indiana, that is only 2 to 4 degrees warmer, will be much more comfortable and much less disruptive than in India that ends up being 7 to 10 degrees warmer. So we want to do what we can about that. And that brings us to our next point of greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So this is what I want to spend most of today's presentation speaking about. And greenhouse gas emissions inventories are a great place to start for a community, a business, an organization looking to address their impacts on the environment. So what is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory? A greenhouse gas emissions inventory is an inventory that quantifies the amount of GHGs released by man-made sources within a defined boundary or from a specific organization within a 12-month period. Why would you do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory? Well, it's a very important first step for government or organization to understand what their emission sources are, and so they can set a benchmark and guide and track greenhouse gas reductions over time. A popular business management quote that is very appropriate here is that you can't manage what you don't measure. So just like you can't have a budget if you aren't measuring how much money is coming in and out, you can't know what you should be doing about greenhouse gas emissions if you're not measuring what kinds of impacts your greenhouse gases are having and where they're coming from. So a greenhouse gas emissions inventory is a great place to start with this work. So big picture, where does greenhouse gas emissions inventory fit into climate work? And what does the process look like? So it all begins with some leadership commitment. So this can come from your mayor, a city council, a CEO if you're a business, or a boardroom. But there needs to be a leadership commitment that acknowledges that there are environmental problems and that you want to actively work to address those issues. And so step one, after the leader makes said commitment, is to look into doing an inventory of those emissions. That's where you're going to get that baseline of information of what kinds of impacts you are responsible for on the environment. After you complete a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, you can move on to step two of establishing a target. And these targets can be long-term targets, such as looking to 2030 or 2050, which are popular targets in line with national and international programs and agreements. So starting to look at some long-term targets of where you want to be as a community organization. After you get an idea of what it is you want to achieve, you can work on developing a climate action plan where you actually lay out the specific strategies and goals and steps that you want to take to help you reduce those environmental impacts. Milestone 4, that's where you get to work implementing that plan that you just spent plenty of time developing. So doing what you have to do to cut down on those emissions that you've tracked. Then milestone 5, that's where you need to be constantly monitoring and evaluating your progress as you go. And that can lead you right back to doing another greenhouse gas emissions inventory in the future to update and start tracking your trends over time. So that is what the general picture looks like with a greenhouse gas emissions inventory fitting into the climate work for a local government or an organization. So as I mentioned, greenhouse gas emissions inventories can be done by just about anybody or any organization. A lot of my slides here are going to focus on local government examples. That's just where my personal experience is. But greenhouse gas emissions inventories can also be done by businesses and nonprofits and different organizations. They can even be done at the individual or household level. So as a local government, you can look at doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for your entire community, meaning taking into account everything within your jurisdictional or political boundaries and accounting for all the emissions being created within that geographic region. That's a very standard and common practice for greenhouse gas emissions accounting for local governments. Local governments can also look to do a local government operations inventory. And that's where you just focus on those direct things that a local government has control over, such as just looking at the emissions from the buildings and vehicles that have city of Indianapolis or city of Bloomington on it, right? Just those direct things that the government is actually controlling and running every day. Now, private businesses, of course, can do their own version of greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And for a private business, they could look at doing their direct operations and facilities. Again, just those primary locations and resources that they use throughout their days. Or a private business could also look to do an inventory, taking into account their full supply chain and looking at the emissions that are produced from all the different materials that they source from all over the world or country. So those are some different things that a private business would need to consider when doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And then lastly, individuals can also do their own version of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And when we're talking at the individual level, the language usually shifts to looking at your carbon footprint. It's more or less the same type of deal as a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And that you can look at your personal carbon footprint, or you can look at your household carbon footprint. And there are some calculators online and tools online to help individuals look into this for their own information. When getting started with a GHG inventory, there's at least 2 points here that you need to have decided on. And those are the boundaries and the base year that you're going to use for your inventory. And so if the boundaries, there's a few different things to consider. Now, if you're a local government, you may just want to use your jurisdictional boundary, all the geographic land that you have some form of political control over or representation for. So that could be one option for a local government. But for businesses or different entities that want to look at their inventories, you're going to probably want to decide between operation control or financial control. So operational control would mean taking into account all the facilities and resources that you have direct responsibility and control over, whether you own the facility or not. An example of that would be, maybe you lease a warehouse space and you have full control more or less of how things operate within that warehouse. So you have operational control of what's going on there, and you may want to take it into account. An alternative way to set that boundary is to look at financial control. And that's where maybe you own a variety of properties, but again, you don't actually manage everything that happens day to day within those properties. You lease them out to other entities. But for accounting reasons, maybe you want to record everything under your financial control and take that into account in your greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So that would be another alternative way to do it. And that's just something that you need to set and make clear from the start of your inventory work. The second thing that needs to be decided is the base year that you want to use for your greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So again, this work's generally done in a 12-month period. And I'll say, generally speaking, that's a 12-month calendar year period. So most people and organizations are going to choose a calendar year to work with. Again, there may be situations or organizations out there that want to do it on a fiscal year, and that's totally fine. But the goal here is for people to account for a 12-year period of what their emission, or 12-month period of what their emissions look like. When you're choosing a year, you're going to want to pick something that's recent so that there's data available. If you start looking back 5 or 10 years, it's entirely possible that data has been lost, that you or other organizations you need to reach out to gather that data have lost some of that information, or maybe switched over operating systems and no longer hold records from 5 or 10 years ago. So you're going to want to pick something from a recent year that's fully completed so you can actually complete the inventory. Secondly, you're going to want to avoid years with anomalies. And kind of unfortunately, we have a perfect example of what that could look like in the past year or so. 2020 does not generally make for a good year to start as a baseline inventory because of the coronavirus pandemic and everybody switching to working from home and work not going about business as usual. 2020 does not generally make for a good baseline year for this. So if you're looking to do an inventory soon, I would suggest looking back a little bit past that, or looking to do 2021 once the calendar year is over. Now, of course, it could certainly be an interesting study to look at what a baseline year prior to 2020 looks like, and then comparing that to what the impacts of the coronavirus were on your emissions. But again, that does not mean that that's a good baseline year to work from. And when we're doing inventory work, the greenhouse gas emissions and the data that you gather are going to be split up into 3 different scopes. And this is the language used in this field. So I want to take some time to explain what these different scopes mean. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions coming from your jurisdiction. So that can be vehicles traveling within your boundaries, factories, your power plants, and the emissions that they're producing, things of that nature. Basically, taking into account any tailpipes, smokestacks, and chimneys that are emitting pollutants from within whatever boundaries you are working with. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect emissions from the purchased electricity and heating from within your boundary or community. So again, those emissions are being created and happening at power plants that are more than likely outside of your jurisdiction. But that energy is being produced and those emissions are happening directly because of the power being used within your jurisdiction. So you account for all that as part of your inventory, and that's considered a scope 2 emission. And then third are scope 3 emissions, which are all other indirect emissions that would not fall under scope 1 or scope 2. So some examples of that would be solid waste that is shipped to a landfill outside of your jurisdictional boundary and breaks down within that landfill. So you would account for that as a scope 3 emission. If you're doing your full supply chain, the production of all those purchased materials that you use would be considered scope 3 emissions. And any unusual, like out of boundaries travel that you do would also be considered like scope 3 emissions. So to help us kind of visualize this, I have this chart here where on the left, you can see scope 1 emissions being everything that's actually happening within your boundaries. So in-boundary transportation, stationary fuel combustion, any in-boundary waste breaking down, and industrial processes and agricultural uses happening within your community. Scope 2 is the grid supplied electricity that your community is purchasing. And then scope 3 is all other indirect emissions. It could be some out of boundary transportation that you want to take into account. It could be the waste that you're shipping outside of your community. So anything else that's not happening directly within your community would fall under scope 3 emissions. Another way that all of the emissions are categorized is by sectors. And so sectors are more of like what category these emissions are coming from, what use these emissions are coming from. So the 4 primary sectors that are generally looked at are transportation. So all the on-road, off-road, passenger and freight transportation going on within your jurisdiction, energy use, solid waste, and water and wastewater. Again, so these lists are from doing greenhouse gas emissions inventories with local governments, but all of this information can certainly be adapted to businesses and organizations also looking to do this work. But a local government looking to do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for their community is going to need to account for the transportation and mobile sources within their jurisdictional boundary, the residential energy being used, commercial energy being used, industrial energy being used, solid waste, and water and wastewater happening within their communities. These are basically the required sectors to account for with greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Now, if the local government were looking to a local government operations inventory, where they just focus on those things that they have direct control over, the actual city of Indianapolis, city of Bloomington branded buildings and vehicles again. For that type of inventory, what they're going to need to account for are their buildings and facilities that they operate, the streetlights and traffic signals that they're responsible for, their vehicle fleet. They're likely going to want to account for their employee commutes and the water and wastewater treatment facilities that they own and operate. So that's what a local government operations inventory would need to take into account. And similarly, if you were a private business looking to do this, I think the sectors that you would look at would look fairly similar to that, minus maybe the streetlights and traffic signals. Now, if you're looking to dive into a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, I do want to let you know that there are some protocols out there that exist. So these are the instructions and rule books of how to do this. And these are standards that are set and used all throughout the country and all throughout the world to make sure we're all doing this work in the same methods. So these are all freely available online. But I would just want to kind of hit on a few of these different options. So there's the US Community Protocol. So that's in the instructions and guidebook for, as it clearly says, for US communities on how to do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And the way that this is different from the other ones is that it really references certain things that are only available for data sources here in the US. So it's just a little more clear about where you can go to find the information that you're going to need for gathering all of the data for a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. If you follow the US Community Protocol, that is totally in line with global reporting if you're looking to report to various international standards on greenhouse gas emissions accounting. There's also the Global Protocol for community scale greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this one is the one that's used all over the world. So you can certainly follow this here in the US, but again, it's not going to be as clear about where you need to go for the data that you need to gather. But this is basically the gold standard of how to do an inventory throughout the world and how everybody gathers and reports this information. And lastly, there is a protocol for local government operations. So that again is the guidebook on how to do this when you're just trying to isolate those activities that a local government has direct control over. So all these are readily available online for free. And if you're looking to get into this work, skimming over those resources is a great place to start. All right, so next I want to move into a closer look at all the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit into the world and start to take a look at what greenhouse gas emissions results look like nationally and from communities here in Indiana. So I want to refer back to this chart of the primary greenhouse gases that we're concerned with. Again, these first three are naturally occurring on our planet and within our planet's natural systems. And the bottom three only occur through our human activities. So one thing is that with greenhouse gas emissions work, everything is standardized into a unit known as carbon dioxide equivalents. All these different greenhouse gases have different potencies and last within our atmospheres for different lengths of time. You know, they're not all equal. So we standardize it down to a carbon dioxide equivalent. And you can see the different potencies of these greenhouse gases in this global warming potential scale. So 1 unit of carbon dioxide would be equal to, or I guess let's start with methane. Methane, 1 unit of methane would be 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide. Similarly, N2O is about 300 times as potent as 1 unit of carbon dioxide. When you start looking at these HFCs and PFCs, you start seeing that they're 12,000 to 23,000 times as potent as 1 unit of carbon dioxide. So those are certainly of major concern to us. And they last in the atmosphere for a very long time before they really dissipate and are no longer a problem for us. So I just want you to understand that not all greenhouse gases are equal, but we do have a system and measurement for equalizing them so that we are able to record and track them. So here, this is a snapshot from the EPA's website of the overview of all US greenhouse gas emissions based on the gases emitted. So from the US, 80% of the gases that we are emitting are carbon dioxide. 10% of those emissions are methane, 7% are nitrous oxide, and 3% are those fluorinated gases. This slide's looking a little blurry on my screen, so my apologies for that. But looking at breaking down those emissions by the sectors of where they come from and seeing the total amount of emissions that the US as a whole is emitting. The US is emitting 6,456.72 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's our whole nation's greenhouse gas emissions right there. And you can see from this chart that the largest sector for it is transportation at 29%. Right behind that at 28% of those emissions is our electricity generation. And then in industry at 22%. And then these last three sectors are much smaller than those first three, but agriculture accounts for 9%. Our commercial industries commercial businesses account for 7%, and our residential energy uses account for 5% of our emissions nationally. So I want to focus in and look at the greenhouse gas emissions inventories that have been done here in Indiana. So in 2019, 15 of our local governments across the state completed greenhouse gas emissions inventories as a part of the Environmental Resilience Institute's first Resilience Cohort program. And those 15 local governments covered approximately 17% of Indiana's population. 7 of those communities also took it upon themselves to complete local government operations inventories and to isolate just what their daily government operations account for. This year, we have 22 more jurisdictions completing greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And at the conclusion of this year, once all those communities are done, nearly 50% of Indiana's population will be accounted for in community-scale greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And we're going to hear from our student, our climate fellow, Hannah, in just a little bit on what that experience was like for her. So I want to give you an example of what these inventories look like here in Indiana. So here, I'm using Fishers as an example because I actually conducted this inventory on behalf of the city of Fishers. So here I did 2 different years of inventory so we could start seeing a trend of what's happening in the community. So in 2015, you can see that the Fishers community was emitting about 1.25 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. By 2018, the community of Fishers was emitting about 1.26 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we are seeing a slight increase in emissions, but that's really not surprising because it's a growing community and the population has increased over that time as well. If you look at that chart at the bottom, you can see that the per capita carbon dioxide equivalents actually declined over that time. It would take a little more research and study to exactly pinpoint why that is, but I have reason to believe that part of the reason the emissions declined over that time is because the utilities that we get our energy from are starting to clean up their resources that they're using for their power production. So switching off a little bit more coal and looking to natural gas, which is cleaner, or even renewable energies, bringing those online. And when you look at the breakdown of this inventory, you can see that the majority of the emissions are coming from residential energy. And if you know anything about Fishers, I think you'd understand that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a suburban community just outside of Indianapolis. So there's a lot of single family homes, and it makes complete sense that the residential energy would account for the largest portion of their emissions in that community. And that's followed right behind transportation, which again makes sense as many of those people will be commuting in to the city for work, very, very likely. So that's just kind of a screenshot of what emissions look like here within Indiana. And here I wanted to show you a few different examples of these inventories from all across the state. And I want you to all understand that, all communities are going to be different. And, doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory is not really designed for people to be able to compare communities, apples to apples, to each other. It's really just most useful for you to use within that local government and track your own trends over time, because every community has different characteristics. Some communities are going to be largely residential. Some are going to have major industries within their boundaries. And some are going to be major transportation hubs and have a lot of different roads and interstates running through them. So you can kind of see that here when you look at Fishers, Gary's, and Fort Wayne's inventories, that their total emissions are all very different. And the largest sectors of their emissions are all very different. So we just want you to get a sense that every community is going to look different. All right, my last slide for this portion of the presentation, I just want to highlight some of the different organizations out there that are useful for this kind of work. So the first one I want to highlight is ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. Now, this is a national nonprofit that does have a US headquarters as well, or an international nonprofit with a national headquarters. And they are who we work most closely with when we're doing greenhouse gas emissions inventories. They have an online tool called ClearPath. That's essentially an online calculator for completing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for a local government and their communities. So to work with ICLEI on that, with their ClearPath tool, you just have to collect all the data necessary for an inventory, submit it into their ClearPath tool, and it's able to give you an output of the emissions coming from that community. Another organization is CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project. So this is an international nonprofit, and it's one of the major sites where global accounting of greenhouse gas emissions occurs. And so both local governments and businesses submit their information to CDP, and it's a free program and site. And it's really there to help add transparency and accountability to this inventory and environmental work. C40 Cities is a network of the largest cities around the world that are actively working to address their environmental impacts and reduce those impacts. So there's plenty that you can learn from checking out their website and materials. The Urban Sustainability Directors Network is a useful site for those that work with local governments and serve in any kind of sustainability director role for the community. They provide resources for local governments doing this work in both the US and Canada. ACEEE is the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and they offer a lot of great resources. They do a lot of great webinars and trainings and different topics on how we can make our communities and different things more energy efficient, of course. So that's definitely a great learning resource out there available to everybody. And then lastly, one I mentioned previously in this presentation is the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, which hosts the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. And again, that's where you can find some really detailed research of what's expected to happen here on the ground in Indiana. And I definitely recommend you checking that out if you have not already. All right, so before I move on to this next section, I just want to go ahead and check the Q&A and see what kinds of questions we've had coming in. So Hannah, have we had some questions that we need to address from this past section?
Most of them we can answer later on. Sadie did ask if we could share the greenhouse gas chart, though.
Okay.
That
Yes.
was discussed in this section.
Wonderful. That sounds good. Yes, we'll be able to share that with you. All right. Well, we will hold the rest of the questions till the end, and I'll keep moving along here so we get through everything today. All right. So for this next section, I want to cover who has the data you need. Now, again, this material that I'm going to cover is going to be more specifically for local governments, but again, it's very adaptable to private businesses and organizations as well. So when you're looking to gather information on residential, commercial, and industrial electricity, the first place you're going to want to try to go for that information is directly to your electricity utility. Generally speaking, they are able to find and gather this information for you. Some of the utilities out there may charge you a fee for gathering that information, providing it to you, but generally speaking, they can get that to you. And for all these things, if your first avenue for finding this information is not available, there are workarounds and there are ways to calculate and estimate or otherwise add up this information. So, just because you can't get the information from one source does not mean you can't figure it out with a workaround. When it comes to natural gas use, again, for that one, you're going to start by reaching out to your utility and trying to gather it directly from them. On-road transportation and off-road transportation. One of the first places you may want to look for that could be a regional metropolitan planning organization. Most of our cities, counties, towns are going to be covered by such an organization. And if not, and if they don't have the information that you need for running these calculations, another source you could look to would be state level data, as state level departments of transportation generally have vehicle miles traveled within particular boundaries. You're going to want to gather your solid waste information. And for that, you could look to contact first whoever your waste haulers are. So in some places, the cities themselves manage their own waste collection. In other places, they contract that out to private businesses, and they may be able to provide the information of how much waste they collect within your territory. You could also look, if you are able to identify what landfill the waste goes to, they may be able to provide the information on how much waste comes from your specific jurisdiction. And then the other sector that you're going to want to gather your data from will be water and wastewater. And again, you're going to want to reach out to the water and wastewater utility and see if they can provide that information directly to you, of how much is being consumed within the geographic area in question. And again, water and wastewater treatment facilities, those sometimes are owned and operated by the local government themselves. So if you're working on the local government level, hopefully they are able to comply with you and get that information to you. Some of the additional data sources that you may want to go to for completing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, you may want to look at the US Census. That can provide a lot of useful information about the populations for your community. And here in Indiana, a couple of useful resources that a lot of other states would also have available on their state websites include an Indiana waste characterization study. So that helps you get an understanding of the different materials going to your landfills. And that's required information in the calculations of doing this work. And again, you can look to your state level DOTs, such as INDOT, to gather like vehicle miles traveled, such as by county, and even broken down by specific cities and towns. So that can be very useful information when calculating transportation data. One thing I want to note is that the data will not always be specific to your jurisdiction. Whatever data and resources you're able to find, it's not always going to be exactly what you need. So be prepared when doing this work to scale that data from maybe a county or regional or statewide data set and scale that to your appropriate population. And I want to move on to a few other tips with this work. So one thing to remember with this is that greenhouse gas emissions inventories are estimates. At the end of the day, this is us doing our best with the information we're able to gather to estimate what the greenhouse gas emissions are from our communities. So there's always a little bit of guesswork involved, and you just have to be comfortable with that and understand that we are doing our best, and we are following, as long as you're following the protocols and guidelines that are set out there, we should be on track with some accurate results. Again, as I mentioned, follow the protocols. So those are the guidelines on how to do this and how to make sure what you're doing is appropriate and complies with international standards. As I mentioned, not all data will be perfect. You need to be able to find the best data that you can and keep moving forward. You can't totally stall out when you're not finding the exactly perfect information for whatever jurisdiction or organization you're taking a look at. And of course, remember that if better data becomes available, you can always go back and revise your calculations and the information that you have. So don't be afraid to do so. Those are just my personal helpful tips and recommendations for people looking to do greenhouse gas emissions inventories. All right, so for this next section, I want to go ahead and highlight and explain some of the different programs that we have to offer at the Environmental Resilience Institute. And in particular, I want to highlight the program that I help lead, the Resilience Cohort. So the Resilience Cohort is our program where we help lead cities, towns, and county governments here in Indiana through the process of measuring, managing, and tracking their greenhouse gas emissions. This program was launched in 2019. And through this program, participants join a cohort of peers where each jurisdiction involved will receive some one-on-one guidance to help them through these projects. They will receive training webinars to help provide instructions and next steps in the processes for doing this work. And they'll have the opportunity to apply for additional staff capacity by hosting a summer intern through our McKinney Climate Fellows program, which is a wonderful opportunity. Our Resilience Cohort program is broken down into 3 separate stages. So stage 1 is the measuring greenhouse gases stage, where we do this kind of work, where we guide communities and local governments through the process of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So if you're new to this environmental work, that's often a great place for you to start and jump into this work with us, and we will help guide you through this process. Our stage 2 cohort is planning for action. That's where we help local governments develop climate action plans and setting goals and strategies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, for us, a prerequisite to join our stage 2 planning for action cohort is that you must have a greenhouse gas emissions inventory complete so that we know where you're starting from and what sectors are causing most of your emissions. And lastly is our stage 3 resilience cohort on implementation. That's where we help local governments through programs and processes that should help them actually reduce their emissions, at least over time. So that's where we actually get to work on cutting down on those emissions. This here is a picture of our former climate fellow, Aaron Lasher, with the mayor of Evansville, Indiana, who did some of this work in that government. Just kind of hitting on some of the highlights of the Resilience Cohort program. In year 1, in 2019, we had 14 local governments complete greenhouse gas emissions inventories. In year 2, we've had 11 local governments work on developing climate action plans. In year 3, which is this year, we have 22 local governments that are working on greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And we have 12 other local governments that are working on implementation projects in our stage 3 resilience cohort. Want to mention the programming that we're going to be offering next year with the resilience cohort. So we will be running our planning for action stage 2 cohort next year. So any governments that have completed a greenhouse gas emissions inventory can apply for this cohort to have guidance on developing a climate action plan for their community. And for communities that want to get involved in implementation work, we will have our stage 3 implementation programming on urban green infrastructure next year, where we're going to help local governments with developing urban tree canopies and developing tree planting guides for their communities, as well as guide them through the process of preparing a grant application to fund those tree planting projects. So the applications for this programming is available. It is online on Sustain IU's website, our partner organization, which is the IU's Office of Sustainability. So if you're interested in this programming, please check out that website and apply. In conjunction with our resilience cohort programming, we offer the McKinney, what is now the McKinney Climate Fellows program. And through this program, we pair up very bright and intelligent undergrad and graduate students from all the IU campuses to work with local governments, businesses, and nonprofits to help them on sustainability and climate related projects. So this program was started in 2017, and it's a workforce development program for all IU students across all campuses. And each year we can have about up to 35 students working with nonprofits, private businesses, and municipalities across Indiana. So if you're a student on this call, we'll be looking to gather applications for this program in the springtime. And we're looking forward to that and to pair you up with all these wonderful organizations and communities who are doing this work. So that's just a brief overview of what we have to offer through the Environmental Resilience Institute and Sustain IU. All righty, I want to stop here. We can, Hannah, are there any questions that we should address?
We do have some really good questions in the chat.
Okay.
One, though, I think we could probably address now is, will opportunities in the resilience cohort for graduating students be available?
So you do have to be an IU student to participate in the Climate Fellows program, if that's what they're referring to here.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. So you would have to be a current student to participate, but we certainly do offer various like networking opportunities. So if you just want to be able to get connected with Climate Fellows, we could certainly look to get you connected with this group. As for the resilience cohort, again, for that, our partners, if you happen to have accept a role with a community or nonprofit or business that would be interested in doing environmental work upon graduation, then we'd be certainly happy to open this up to you at that time.
Yeah, awesome. I believe the rest of these could probably be answered after, and I might even answer some of them with mine.
Okay, wonderful. Well, all right. Well, Hannah, if you are ready, I can go ahead and pass it over to you and let you present on your case study of doing this work with the city of Huntington.
Yeah, that sounds good. Just a reminder, I was an Indiana Climate Fellow over the summer with this program that Steve was just talking about. It was a really great experience and definitely recommend uh, cities to participate as well as students to be climate fellows. Over the summer, I worked on City of Huntington's first greenhouse gas inventory with Mayor Richard Strick and his council on environmental stewardship within the city. So you can go to the next slide. So just a little bit about Huntington. They are located in the northeast region of Indiana, just right outside of Fort Wayne. They are a smaller city here in Indiana, about 17,000 people, a little over, and about 4,700 households. That is the most recent census data. And within the city, they do have some industrial facilities. It is a lot of residential though, and very commercial heavy. So a lot of businesses. And one thing that I thought was interesting for being such a smaller area, they do have a lot of congregations. So churches and any other buildings for worship. You can go move on. So like I said, this was Huntington's very first greenhouse gas inventory that I completed, and we used, for obvious reasons, the baseline year of 2019. Like Steve said before, we could have used 2020, but that would have not been the most accurate data because of COVID and all of those anomalies. So we chose 2019 because that is the most recent year with the most accurate data that could represent what the city of Huntington did emit for greenhouse gases. And so I added this picture. Like Steve said, you do choose your jurisdiction and where you will receive those those emissions data from. So within the red line here, those are the borders of Huntington. You can see an outlier on the outside, but all of the emissions data is representative of what is within that red line. And for 2019, for those inventories, I completed two inventories, two different ones, one for the community, and then another one for local government operations. So the community, again, is all of the greenhouse gas emissions within this jurisdiction of Huntington. So within that red border. And then a local government operations is all of the emissions that the local government was responsible for in 2019 within that community. So you can go to the next slide just to give you a better idea, because this can get a little confusing. The community emissions is everything within the borders of that jurisdiction. So for Huntington, everything within the town limits. And then the local government operations inventory was just a subset of that. So it just told us what the local government was responsible for within that community. So you move on. So just a reminder, you have seen this slide before. I did just want to bring it up again because there are two different inventories that I did complete over the summer for Huntington. So the community stays the same. You have the transportation, mobile sources, residential, commercial, industrial energy use, solid waste, and then water and wastewater. And then for the local government, you have all of the emissions that come from buildings and facilities, street lights and traffic signals owned by Huntington, their vehicle fleets. So that's going to include any government vehicle, fire trucks, as well as the police vehicle fleet, and then employee commute data, which I completed through a survey that I distributed over the summer. and then the water and wastewater treatment facilities that are within Huntington and also owned by the local government. And then the one difference for Huntington, which is very interesting, is that we included a solid waste section for their government inventory. The reason being is that the city of Huntington is actually the very last city and municipality in Indiana to own and operate its own landfill. And so in 2019, they did close down the landfill, but we decided to include this in this baseline inventory because it is the most accurate representation of their greenhouse gas emissions up until the closure of the landfill when they stopped accepting waste from the community there. So that is the only difference between Huntington, their local government, versus what Steve showed you earlier. You can move on. So I did just want to show you guys some of the data and the results that can come from doing a greenhouse gas inventory. Again, this is the first step. This tells you what a community is responsible for, how much greenhouse gas emissions they contribute to what Steve showed earlier with all of the US greenhouse gas emissions. So Huntington is it is a smaller town, and being in Indiana, it is a small fish in a big pond, but they do make a huge difference. And any way that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions counts towards climate change mitigation. So from the inventory, I was able to determine that in 2019, Huntington's greenhouse gas emissions were about 417,000 greenhouse gas emissions within that calendar year. And that is, again, the community-wide CO2 equivalent emissions. And just a reminder, CO2 equivalent includes carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and those methane gases. We did just focus on those three as they are the most prominent in greenhouse gases towards climate change. And so what we were able to find, and as you can see on this pie chart, is that Huntington's most emission intensive sector in general is energy. And this result, because it is, I believe, about 77% of the community's total emissions, this result can help Huntington determine the best implementation practices and programs and projects that they want to move forward with in their climate action plan. And like I said, Huntington is commercial heavy, so this does make sense that commercial energy was the greatest sector for greenhouse gas emissions within Huntington. And then you have industrial energy just right below that at 26% of these emissions, and then residential energy as well. You can move on. So again, the local government operations inventory is a small portion of the community inventory. It just tells us out of all of the emissions in the community, how much of those was the local government responsible for. And I was able to determine that they were responsible for about 40,809 metric tons of CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. As you can see, the majority of that does come from the solid waste sector. So when they do an inventory later on, they will see this change since it did close in 2019. But again, this is going to be a really great baseline inventory that will show them what they are responsible for now and how they can change later on, especially how changing their landfill operations for the future. And so the next right after solid waste, what they would need to focus on, especially since they did close the landfill in 2019, is their water and wastewater, where that is probably going to be at the moment and moving forward into the future, the greatest emitter of all of the different sectors within the local government operations. You can go on. So I just wanted to add this, just so you guys know, it is not required to do a local government operations inventory. This was a choice for Huntington to complete and develop. And I personally think it was one of the best things that they decided to do, because we figured out that about 10% of the community emissions came from local government operations, which may seem like a small amount, but that can make a huge difference, especially when they were emitting over 400,000 emissions in the community. So reducing even that 10% is going to make a huge difference. Okay, next. And Steve did touch on this a little bit, but I wanted to go through it just one more time. Reasons why this is so important, especially in Indiana, because a lot of people think, oh, well, you're in the Midwest, sea level rise is not going to impact you. All these big impacts are not going to impact you because you are landlocked. But what people don't realize, and especially since we do have that report and the assessment that Steve mentioned before, we have realized that we are experiencing way more impacts than anyone ever thought. So these impacts are going to be record-breaking heat waves, delayed fall freeze, reduced water and air quality, decreased productivity, loss of species, increased heavy rainfall with more flooding, which I know even in Bloomington, we have seen flooding issues recently with those heavy rainfalls. And then shorter winters, and then increased demand for cooling as we do have higher heat events and those longer heat waves. And one thing that we found with Huntington specifically too, right before I joined their team, the Environmental Resilience Institute did an assessment themselves for Huntington and found that in Huntington specifically, they are about on a scale from 1 to 10, about a 5 on preparedness for these high heat events, flooding, and just overall drought intensity. And just some numbers to throw at you guys. These high heat events right now, they're experiencing about 24 of these high heat days and nights. And in 2050, they could experience between 66 to 79 high heat days and nights. And I don't know about you, but I do not want to walk outside that much. It already feels super, super hot out. And then also spring and winter precipitation is supposed to increase with an increase of 13 to 20% across the state. And right now, 42% of the precipitation that is already falling is as heavy rain downpours. And again, flooding can be a big issue with that if we are not prepared as cities. You can go on. So with that, between knowing these impacts that Indiana is going to experience or could experience, and then now that Huntington has the greenhouse gas inventories and knows what sectors to really focus on, I came up with these just 6 different opportunities that I saw in Huntington that I actually presented at the city council meeting back in June or back in July. And so the first one, again, the energy sector was the most emission intensive sector. So all 3 of them were the top 3. So commercial being the first, industrial, and then residential. And an opportunity in Huntington would be to increase energy efficiency. This is an older town, So it makes sense that a lot of these buildings are not as energy efficient as they might be or could be. And doing energy assessments would be the best solution to start with to determine how to make them the most energy efficient that they could be, while also keeping that historical build. And as they transition or continue to make these facilities energy efficient, they could transition to renewable energy, so solar power and wind power. This would be really nice, especially being in Northeast Indiana. This would be a really great location for both energy sources. And then one thing that they're actually already doing, Steve mentioned grants for green space and planting trees. Huntington actually just received a grant, and they will be planting about 100 trees through the DNR. And that will also, as we know, trees are carbon sinks, and they could themselves reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But just remember, they are not the only solution. You also need to stop emitting as much as you do. And then there's been talk you could transition vehicle fleets to electric vehicles or install charging stations within the city as well. And then again, flooding is such a big issue and concern. And I know Huntington has already put so much effort into stormwater efficiency, but being prepared even more for that expected increase of heavy rain fall events will definitely benefit their community. And then lastly, education is key. This is why we have conferences like this. And also this is why they come out with press releases, and just being completely transparent with the community will help decrease greenhouse gas emissions, especially at an individual level. It can help people understand how they can be more energy efficient, or how they can plant more trees and how that would help. So education is definitely key. And then next. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about with the program and just making a greenhouse gas inventory over the summer, just some challenges that I did, come across. This is completely personal, so I do not speak on every climate fellow. Again, every city is different, so we will have different challenges. But the biggest one was with data collection. I was lucky to work in such a small and close-knit community where they do have a lot of the available data that I needed within one building. So I could just go in and ask and they would have it. But there were some moments that I had to reach out to utility companies where they either would want, a lot of money for the data that we were asking for, or they may just take a little bit longer than what we have to get that data to us. And so with that, there are definitely ways to overcome those challenges. So if it takes too long, what I did and what was always recommended to me was to have backup estimations ready to go, just in case you did get at the end of the summer and you didn't have all the data, you could at least have those estimations, because like Steve said before, greenhouse gas inventories are not always going to be perfect, but they are important to have. And using census data can get you a pretty accurate piece of information that is needed for the inventory. And then also with data collection, again, time was kind of a challenge. We did do this within 3 months. And again, sometimes if you realize that you need a piece of data and you only have a month left, you're just like, oh my gosh, where am I going to get this from? Or how long is this going to take? Sometimes again, making those estimations ahead of time and possibly finding other ways to find that information. So for the local government operations, for example, I had a hard time gathering the government energy data, being so far into the inventory process already. And I realized, oh, well, I wonder if the clerk's office has their energy bills. And they did. So I went through and compiled all the data throughout the year 2019 and just found that separate, more time consuming way to get the data, but it was still better than even estimating it from census data. And then communicating results. If anyone has ever talked about climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, you could probably understand how that can start to become a little technical. And this is technical information. It is hard to communicate this information to people, especially to communities. Like I said, I did a presentation on this at a city council meeting with the public, and that was my biggest challenge, was just finding a way to communicate this to make it as easy as possible to understand, and also make sure it is known that it is important. And then with that too, you do have skeptics of climate change. And so I realized that instead of talking about climate change, talk about all the concerns that come with it. So increased flooding, those high heat events, increased demand for cooling. These are all things that communities will understand, and they'll be like, oh yeah, you're right. Or we haven't seen snow on Christmas for a while. Stuff like that. Just making it more relatable and easier to discuss with the layman and people who may not be so eager to listen right away. And then lastly, with COVID, it has been different. We did have some people who were remote doing greenhouse gas inventories. I was lucky to be in person, but I did myself, I see that challenge because I did work remote for a couple of weeks there, and it is different. Like I said, was able to go into different offices during the day and just be like, hey, do you have this? Or when can I get this? And instead of just remote work where you're emailing or Zoom, and it doesn't stop you from doing an inventory, but it was just a challenge that I experienced myself, just knowing that difference. And like I said, I was lucky to be in person this past year and realizing how important a greenhouse gas inventory is definitely, it's just big. I didn't realize that before doing this work, and especially being there in person and seeing the difference that this was making head on and just right there with my eyes. And it's just really cool. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your sharing how this past summer went in your work in Huntington. So we got about 10 minutes left, and we can try to answer as many questions that we have in the chat as possible in this time. I did see a couple questions that were about, will we share our slides, and can we share the specific greenhouse gas emissions chart? And I'm happy to share my slides. Hannah, is that okay with you if this presentation is shared? So we are happy to have these slides shared with everybody. So I hope that, and then you can certainly be able to get that primary greenhouse gas emissions chart from that as well. So I hope that takes care of those questions for you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read through some of these questions here for us and have Hannah and I answer them as best we can this time. We do have one question, Hannah, about the tree planting grant that you've received in Huntington. I'm not sure if you have this information or not, but do you know what kind of trees they are looking to plant? And do you know if they're going to be ones that are native to Huntington?
Yes, that is actually one of the things that we added in the design, was that they are all native to Indiana. We are not using maple trees as the DNR said that they are currently being infested by some beetles. So not the best to plant in Indiana, but yes, they are all Indiana native trees.
Wonderful, thank you. I see another question in the chat. That's what's a reasonable expected timeline for data collection for a city of 100,000 or a city of 30,000 or less? And to that, I want to go ahead and point out, I would say an expected timeline for this work, regardless of population size, would be about 3 to 6 months. This summer, we had communities such as Huntington, with was about 17,000 population, doing an inventory in that time frame. We had Indianapolis with a population of 850,000 do a inventory in that time. So population really should not make a big impact on how long it takes to collect the information. I see another question here of which category does agriculture fall under? So if you're doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, you can also include a sector on agriculture. I know I did not include that in my list of sectors, as it doesn't necessarily apply to all communities, but if you do have ag in your community, that can be a whole separate section within your inventory. Hannah, I'm curious, is agriculture at all a big part of Huntington's economy, or what led you to decision whether to include or not include agriculture there?
No, so there was a small lot that just happened to be a little within the jurisdiction of Huntington, which we did leave out because it wasn't going to make that much of a difference in the inventory itself. But no, agriculture was not a huge sector in the jurisdictions of Huntington, because I thought that was interesting because they were all on the outside of town limits.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that perspective. And here's one more question for you, Hannah. When you did present the results to City Council, how did they respond to your work? And I know you hit on this a little bit in your presentation, but how do you convey the importance of this tracking to council members that may be a little more hesitant about the importance of this?
Yeah, so honestly, I was really excited to present these results to the crowd that I did. Huntington is mostly conservative, mostly Republican, and so the views sometimes this isn't a super stereotype moment, but it just does sometimes, have that moment of, oh, some people don't maybe have climate change in the forefront of their mind. So they were a lot better than anyone really thought that they would be. They asked really nice questions. They were really receptive to the increase of flooding, like I said before, and all those real impacts that they are seeing, and they have been working on projects for and to fix and to prepare for. So hopefully I help them realize that they're kind of one and the same. But again, just knowing your audience and know how to convey the information, even if it is in a different way than that is on the environmental track as well.
Thank you. So I see one person asked, what are some examples of out-of-boundary Scope 3 indirect emissions that local governments here in Indiana have included in their inventories? And one immediate example would be communities that have done this work with us so far. Largely, their solid waste data is included as a Scope 3 emission, because for most communities, Huntington's kind of an exception to this rule, but most communities are kind of exporting all that solid waste from their communities to a landfill or incinerator outside of their jurisdictions. So that is one of the primary out-of-boundaries Scope 3 indirect emissions that is accounted for in these inventories. I think some communities may look to account for some of the travel, maybe that some of their employees or different people do in their community, of flights outside of their community, things of that nature, that can be recorded as Scope 3. So I think we've seen some of that recorded as well. But that's kind of the type of thing you would look to record as Scope 3. We have one question: is the U.S. Community Protocol applicable for individual businesses, nonprofits, schools? The U.S. Community Protocol really is directed for local governments specifically. There are very likely some guidelines for businesses, nonprofits, and schools that are looking to do this work that are probably more applicable than using the U.S. Community Protocol. I don't happen to know those resources right offhand, but I'm certain if you need help finding them, I could certainly help you out with that. I think one place you could start would be CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. They may outline what the guidelines are for those different organizations because they record and track greenhouse gas emissions accounting from local governments as well as businesses and organizations. So they may already be able to point you to what those requirements are. Just reading through the questions here. I know we have a question of what about the infrastructure, roads, greenways, et cetera, for local and state governments? How do you include these items? So those types of the activities that happen on that type of infrastructure would be recorded within a community scale greenhouse gas emissions inventory for a local government. So transportation happening on those local roadways, that will get recorded. And for us here in Indiana, one resource we can turn to gather that information is INDOT's vehicle miles traveled database, where they record that information for us. So that is certainly helpful. We do have one big question here at the top of one of our earliest submissions about there being a recorded decline in public trust of government authority and subject matter experts in this field. What can public officials do to strengthen the public's perception of the objectivity of greenhouse gas emissions inventories and related mitigation reports? I mean, that's a big question, and I'm not going to have all the answers for that, right? I can't account for all of the public trust in government authority in our country or world. I think one useful tool to help us with this is things like CDP, so the Carbon Disclosure Project. Again, the whole purpose of that is that it's an international nonprofit to help add transparency and accountability to greenhouse gas emissions inventories and reporting. So the more people are able to report their results to that and all the information of how they calculated and got to those results should help us be able to then go in and evaluate and scrutinize what those results look like, right? So I think by having some international reporting protocols such as that can really help us keep a track on how things are going, more or less. But again, solving an issue of how to make people trust government authority, that's a much bigger question than something I could answer in the next 2 minutes. So I guess a short answer would be I would encourage education as much as possible. All right, looks like we are quickly running out of time, and I'm not sure if our hosts have any final words here, or if we should just keep working on questions.
Nope. Once the Q&A is done, we're just going to have everyone move back into Remo for the networking session. So if you are all done answering, or if you want to answer a few more, it's totally up to you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, we can look to answer one more question here. So let's see. I do know we have one question of whether, if you're looking to do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, whether you should use 2019 or 2020 data. Obviously, people's work schedules and work styles have kind of changed dramatically in that year period. And it's a good question of what's normal going to look like moving forward, right? And again, that's not really a question that I am able to answer for you. You or the organization or government that you're working for may need to help make that decision of what's going to be more appropriate moving forward. Generally speaking, I would say 2020 is still going to be an anomaly. I mean, that's still the first year that the pandemic had impacted us, and we made some dramatic shifts in our schedule. So again, even just looking at 2020 itself, The first 3 months are going to look like somebody going into the office maybe 5 days a week, right? And then the next 9 months are going to look like maybe somebody working from home. So there's, regardless, I think 2020 is going to largely look like an anomaly in the data. And if you want to study what that impact was in your emissions, I think that's great. If you want to compare that to the year prior, but I would still recommend that you look to avoid that year otherwise, and look to what emissions look like maybe before the coronavirus pandemic was an issue, and then maybe once this year's over, seeing what maybe 2021 looks like, or what the next few years are going to look like for you. So that's just my own opinion there on that. Again, it's not really up to me to make that decision. It's what's going to be most useful for you when deciding that. So I think with that, I will go ahead and end the Q&A. And I want to thank you all for joining us and having us present today.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Hannah, and anyone who attended this session. Go ahead and move back into Remo and then close out Zoom so you aren't dealing with that bandwidth issue that Jessica mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.